diverse voices in the energy revolution. Here's your host, Amy Simpkins.
Welcome back to the Power Flow podcast. I'm your host, Amy Simpkins, and with me today for today's final interview of season 1 is my colleague, Ahlmahz Negash. Ahlmahz is currently a senior power analyst at Tacoma Power in the long-term resource planning and analysis group. Her role encompasses a wide range of activities, including leading cross-functional teams, resource modeling, evaluating policy impacts, and developing innovative demand-side solutions. Prior to joining Tacoma Power, Ahlmahz was a research fellow at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. She received her bachelor's and her PhD degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Washington in 2010 and 2015, respectively. Ahlmahz, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amy.
Well, I would first, and you also mentioned, actually, I didn't read this in your bio, but you also mentioned to me that you were a traveling international teacher for 10 years before you returned to school for degrees in electrical engineering. So let's start there. You were a traveling international teacher. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I tell people my first college class was in 1992. And I finished my last one in 2015.
So you've been in school forever.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that happened in between. But yeah, so I started teaching back in the 90s. So I started off as a facilitator working in a school. And after doing that for 2 years, traveled abroad for 8 years teaching English. So I was in China, Malaysia, Sudan. I just had a ball traveling the world teaching English. And then after all of that, decided to come back to school and finish up my degree in engineering. So that bachelor's degree took a really long time.
Were you always wanting to be an engineer and this was kind of a break in the middle, or?
Honestly, I always wanted to be a chemist. Like that's what I loved chemistry growing up. And that's what I had majored in. And then when I came back to school after all of those many years, I found that I just couldn't stand chemistry anymore. And people tried to convince me it was the professor, it wasn't me. But I took one class and was like, nope, I'm done. But I was really interested at the time in energy. And so I wasn't really particularly interested in electrical engineering over any of the other ones. I was just any field where I could study energy was going to be good for me. And it was actually the counselor in the electrical engineering department that convinced me to go into electrical engineering. She was just a really kind person. And I was like, if I could go to mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, but you're the nice person, I'd rather go study where you're going to be at. And that's how I ended up in electrical engineering.
Nice. So they were, you belong here.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So what was it about energy that kind of drew you in?
We know that energy is very correlated to outcomes, right? So, or successful outcomes. And when you don't have energy, you have poor outcomes, poor health outcomes, poor economic outcomes. And so I've spent a lot of my life in volunteering, poverty alleviation. I've traveled to developing countries and done a lot of work in those countries. And so it was very natural for me to want to do something that was going to have a positive impact on humanity.
Yeah, I definitely agree that energy is this thing that is required to elevate humankind, and then it also impacts the planet too, right? So it's this all-encompassing, it's the ultimate holistic topic.
Yeah.
That, you have to support people and you have to support the planet. And so I love that you came into it from that supporting humanity place. Tell me about your stint in Norway. I love Norway. And I mean, personally, I've traveled in many of those places, actually, China and Malaysia. I love those places too, but we love Norway. And of course, Norway has, a big history of fossil fuel industries. But they're also pretty progressive in terms of, policy and looking ahead to the future, they're also really far north. So I'm really curious what you were working on, kind of what you saw there.
Yeah, so I ended up in Norway by accident. My plan was to go to Sweden. So I was a National Science Foundation. I got a GRFP fellowship when I was in graduate school, and one of the opportunities for us was to make a proposal to an international institution to do a graduate research opportunity outside of the country. So I had reached out to somebody in Sweden, and she went on vacation just before my application was due. And I was scrambling at the last minute to find a replacement. And I ended up finding a professor in Norway. And he, like, literally the best thing that ever happened to me was, somebody going on vacation and completely ruining my plans. Norway was amazing. I was doing research in demand response. So I valuing distributed energy resources was the topic that I studied in graduate school, and was the topic of my research. And so there was a professor in the industrial economics department, and I wanted to add some economics. I wanted to go somewhere where there would be an economics focus to my work.
Totally.
So that's what I was working on. I was working on. It was at the end of my PhD, so it was literally the last paper that I put out. And I absolutely loved it there. I can't say enough good things about Norway. The people, honestly, were the nicest human beings I've ever met in my life.
Awesome. So the research around distributed energy resources, I mean, do you see a different approach in Norway than here in the US?
Even while I was there back in 2015, electric vehicles was really taking off over there in Norway. Demand response, while I was there, was not really a huge focus. So it was something that I was working on, but wasn't really, like I said, wasn't really a huge focus there. But electric vehicles were, and they when they're managed, can be used as a type of a low flexibility, so a type of a demand response resource. Where I saw there was a lot more advancement in Norway was just in the adoption of technologies. That's what impressed me the most about Norway.
Awesome. Were you seeing them do more behind the meter projects, or were these front of meter, utility involvement projects?
So I actually wasn't involved in that. I was more on the economic side of developing the evaluation of them and the value of those resources. So I didn't see that. But while I was there, one of my professors actually had an electric vehicle, and when I first got there, he gave me a ride back to my house, and the whole way there was so I'm in an electric vehicle, and so I'm riding in this lane because I have this right, and he's just giving me all of these different perks that you get because of having electric vehicles. But so I got to see the adoption side of it just from my experiences with the people there. But I that was not part of my actual work. The work was looking at coming up with an appropriate price signal for demand response so that it's compensated fairly for the value that it brings. This was in response to, at the time, FERC had issued Order 745. This was something that I had looked at over the entire course of my PhD.
Right.
So back in 2011, FERC ordered Order 745 gave demand response or required demand response in competitive wholesale markets to be compensated like a generator. And I had always argued that was not the fair way to compensate demand response. And so much of my research was in coming up with alternative ways to compensate demand response in a way that's fair. But of course, obviously, the Supreme Court, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with FERC. And so
this is what we're doing, guys.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you think it should go? What's your vision?
So I had always envisioned demand response being compensated based on the value that it brings. And sometimes that value might be the value of energy, but sometimes it might not be. So So I felt that it was more important to do an evaluation study and see what are those benefits that demand response can provide, and to compensate it based on that value. It might be higher, equal to, or less than the value of energy in any particular time. That was my my proposal. But if, and now it's no longer if, because Supreme Court has already ruled, that DR and wholesale markets will get the LMP, or locational marginal price. So if we're stuck with that, the next best thing that we can do is adjust the way we think about the net benefits test. So Order 745 required the ISOs to do a net benefit test and to determine the threshold at which demand response is no longer cost effective. So once it's no longer cost effective, they're not required to pay the energy price to DR resources. But so determining that methodology now is the next best thing that we can do, since we're going to have to live with paying LMP to demand response resources. And so what I did while I was in Norway was propose an alternative way of thinking about that net benefits test, so that we don't overcompensate, because right now the way the ISOs are developing that threshold, it actually overcompensates demand response. And I say that being a lover of demand response, like nobody wants to see demand response succeed more than me. That was like my baby. I dedicated years of my life to it. But I do believe the way we calculate that net benefits test right now is not fair.
That's really, really fascinating to me. And so I come from this, I do microgrid, design and development, and looking a lot at like the economics of systems. So demand response, of course, is one revenue stream we're looking at balancing with potentially other revenue streams. And what we have found is, the thing about demand response is that it's bankable, whereas some other revenue streams, particularly everyone likes to talk about behind the meter peak shaving and like on-site demand reduction. And like, it's hard. On-site demand reduction is really hard. And like, it takes a huge amount of computation. It takes a really sophisticated controller. And then you have to, so you generate an operational strategy and resulting economic performance from that, and build an economic pro forma for a client. And they're like, well, how do I know? How do I know I'm really going to get that? And I think that's the thing about demand response, is that for whatever reason, and even though it's still market-based, even though it might be still based on LMPs, like you say, there's more of a trust in that overarching, like larger market, that like, that's bankable. Like, we know that will be there. There are bounds on that system. That's a market that we understand. And it's harder to justify the predictions, the economic predictions, performance predictions from like other revenue streams that might not be so well understood. So I think it's really fascinating talking about the nuances of that compensation, because from my perspective, I don't think of it as quite that nuanced. Like, to me, it looks like, well, this is the price, and like, there you go. Like, so I'm really excited to hear about that.
Yeah. So like, I would love a chance, and I missed my opportunity. I don't have very many regrets. One regret that I have in life is I chose to, I ended up going to Norway in the fall of 2015. And it was around that time that the Supreme Court was hearing the case on demand response. And I wanted to submit an amicus brief to the court, and because I had strong opinions about what I thought was fair compensation. And I got too overwhelmed with, it was the final year of my PhD. I was working full time as well. And finally just said, you know what, something's got to go. Right. I will forever regret that, though, because it's a rare occasion that's something that you're passionate about, and that you've dedicated 5 years of your academic career to, manages to land itself at the Supreme Court just as you're about to graduate. And anyway, that's one of my hugest regrets in life.
You can only do what you can do, though, right?
I guess.
So let's talk about, what you're working on now. You're at Tacoma Power. So that's a municipal utility, but
It is.
it's pretty big, a pretty big municipal utility.
If you compare us to our neighbors, we're sort of in the middle. There are some that are smaller than us, some that are bigger than us. We're about a mid-size. We have about 185,000 customers,
Okay.
And about 17,000 commercial customers. So we're not tiny.
And so you're doing long-term resource planning and analysis. So tell me what that looks like.
Yeah, so I work in the Integrated Resource Planning Group. And as you know, utilities of a certain size in Washington State, who have at least 25,000 customers, are required by law every year to develop long-term resource plans. And the purpose of these plans is for us to consider our traditional thermal resources along with renewable resources on an equal footing. That's the whole point behind these integrated resource planning. And so that's what I do. I'm involved in the modeling part of that process, and I'm also engaged in the stakeholder process. So I get to, one of the nice things about the integrated resource planning process is that it's public. We invite folks to come and participate and give their thoughts. So that's what I do. I'm involved in the development of the resource adequacy assessment. And curious what do you know about integrated resource planning? What questions do you have about what goes on in that process?
Oh gosh, honestly, not much. It's funny because here from sort of the behind the meter side, from like the client side, we almost view the utility as a black box. And it is what it is, and the rate tariff is what it is. And and we make some assumptions well, there'll probably be an escalation rate. Obviously, in the next year or two, probably more of an escalation rate than we even thought due to inflation. From where I sit, because I personally, and I definitely work with people who work more on utility scale generation, who are, IPPs, independent power producers, that are interfacing more on that level with the utility. But from my perspective, it's interesting. We are the utility is what it is until it's something different. And so it's really interesting for me to hear and learn, this is an area of, coming into energy, for me personally, that I don't know much about. So I'll give a little bit of my background here that so I mentioned I come from aerospace engineering, and I worked in spacecraft design, integration, and operation for 10 years. And I made the leap over to energy, and some people are like, what? But really, and I joke and say that spacecraft are just microgrids in the sky. And so what I'm doing by working on a building is not so different from working on a spacecraft. It's a closed system. We draw the system boundaries here. There are external interfaces here and here. And there's things that come in, there's things that go out. And once we've characterized all of those, we have a system architecture. And then we get to play around with the bits in the middle and say, okay, now that we've drawn the system boundaries this way, do we want to add in solar? Do we want to add in a battery? What does that look like economically? And so it's the way that, I live inside those system boundaries, and the interfaces to the exterior are just sets of rules that I comply with, and so I say all that to say that I feel really confident talking about microgrids, design, building, planning, those sorts of things. But I don't have a broad educational background on the utility, on the energy industry, only understanding that, utilities have done things, have been very concerned with safety, reliability, keeping the lights on for so many years. And that here now on the cusp of, revolution with new technology and more participation from consumers, more awareness beyond just, hey, my power's out, that I understand that utilities are themselves having to go through a revolution. So I have a lot of questions actually about long-term resource planning, what it looks like, let's see, where should we start? Well, first of all, and this is kind of a small question, but I was curious. You said, we make it open to the public and anyone can come in and participate, give their thoughts and opinions. Do you see a lot of consumer participation in long-range planning?
Unfortunately, not as much as I would like to see. So for the most part, our largest customers are always there. And we have, of course, environmental advocates that'll show up. We might have some consumer advocates that show up. Basically, people whose job it is to show up and that will be paid to show up are the ones that show up. But the people who are impacted most likely are not the ones who show up. And when's the last time these processes are public? I've never shown up to one of these. It's the last thing on anybody's mind, right? So we do get some participation, but not very much from the general public. Although we will have a few that show up from time to time.
Interesting.
It's becoming a little more important though now that. In Washington State, in 2019, we passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which, among other things, requires us to get to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045, but also requires us to do clean energy implementation plans. And the purpose of these clean energy implementation plans is to ensure an equitable transition. So we know we're going to be transitioning to clean energy, but we have to do so in a way that's equitable and that everybody can equitably share those costs and benefits. And because of that new provision of equity in our planning now, it's like critical that we get a lot more input from the folks that are actually being impacted by the decisions that the utility makes. So that I'm hopeful that moving forward we'll be getting more participation, but we might have to think differently about the way we engage our customers, because the way we've done it so far hasn't been bringing people in.
I was wondering about that. Like, what's the marketing like, right? How do you rate in a world of red flags? How do you wave a flag that says, pay attention? Like, I need you over here.
It's tough. It's really tough. And it's, and like I said, it's not fair that we to ask folks to come in uncompensated, because the folks that do show up are actually being paid to show up. No, like these, it's either their job. It's definitely their job, right? Or you're a business owner and you come in and show up. But to get other folks and other voices out there, it's hard because they're not compensated for showing up. Yeah. So maybe they should be.
It's hard. I think that one of the keys, and what I've seen actually, with the podcast here, is a lot of people want to have more awareness, but I do recognize and respect that everyone only has so much attention, right? And we've got a lot of stuff to pay attention to, in life, just doing life. And, how much bandwidth do people have for so much awareness about their usage, consumption, the way they interact with their utility, but recognizing that, I think it's more and more of a priority as climate change stares us in the face. We're going to have to think about it. I'm curious, with your background, how much of your modeling that you're doing is around the economic side, or is it technical, or both?
I'm going to say it's a little bit of both, right? So I do our price forecasting in our capacity expansion. So, and those both use a tool called Aurora, which a lot of the Pacific Northwest utilities use. It's a production cost modeling tool. And so it's there's economics behind it. So the purpose of that capacity expansion is to based off of what your policies and your projections for load growth and the design of the system and transmission that you have, all your nodes and transmission between them, it decides what the most cost-effective build-out of resources would be over the next 10 or 20 years. It's a combination of the technical design of the system and of course the economics that actually is behind the build-out of that system.
Yeah, I love it. You have to have kind of both sides. The economics, I think, tells the story. It tells the story of the technology. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to turn toward the future with Ahlmahz. Don't miss it. back with the Power Flow podcast. We're here today with my colleague Ahlmahz Negash from Tacoma Power. We're talking about long-term resource planning and analysis. And so we're going to talk about looking at the future of the industry. But you're a long-term resource planner. So looking at the future is your job. So let's start there. What are you seeing with City of Tacoma in terms of, and I'm curious about both the load growth side and then this transition with this 2045 goal of 100% clean energy. So there's a generation piece and there's a load growth piece. And I'm curious for your thoughts on what you're seeing happening in your domain.
So this is where it's important to step back and say a little bit about Tacoma Power. We're a 100% hydroelectric utility. So our owned resources that we own are 100% carbon free. But about 50% of the generation portfolio that we have comes from Bonneville, a long-term contract with Bonneville, so BPA. And they're also hydro, predominantly hydro as well. We're a little bit surplus, which means we do a lot of buying and selling in the wholesale market. That wholesale market, however, is not 100% hydro. And so what a little bit of emissions that we have as part of our resource mix comes from our interacting in the market and getting some emissions there. And also from Bonneville doing the same. They wholesale their power and also have a little bit of carbon in their generation mix as well. So we've got a small amount, but we're well over 90% clean just because of the resources that we have.
That's incredible.
Because we're surplus, we could actually meet all of our load with our hydroelectric generation and some. So the focus for us isn't so much on the generation side. Mm-hmm. The focus from us mostly is on the load side. So for Tacoma Power, looking towards the future and wanting to meet the city's carbon goals, that means electrification. So we're sitting on this stockpile of clean energy. The best way that we can help move the city forward in its climate action plans is to electrify. So building electrification, transportation electrification, even electrification of industrial processes. Tacoma Power has for decades been really successful in conservation. That's our first fuel. In fact, for the past several IRPs, we've seen no new resource projected. We've actually been seeing just more conservation. And in 2017, that was the first year where our load forecast is actually projecting a downward trend. We've been so successful in energy conservation, we're not even projecting an upward load anymore. Now that might change with electrification, obviously, because right now our load projections aren't considering what might happen. And that is now, we're just now, when I say just now, I mean had a meeting last week. We're just now coming together as a utility and saying, what should our load projections look like now? So for the longest time, we've been looking at using historical data, using economic data to project our load trends. To be honest, for years we were forecasting way above what was actually happening. We kept forecasting this growing load, and every year it was just going down. And finally, in 2017, you're just the load's going down. And so we're trying to decide now, given that we just recently came to that realization that the load is actually going down. It's there's some, utilities have internal inertia. So the idea of now we're going to start doing something with our load forecast so that we can project load growth again with this electrification is a huge step. But we're coming together as a utility to say, what should we be looking at in terms of load growth, particularly around electrification? And that clearly is going to impact our resource planning and how we think about the future.
Yeah, definitely. That's, asking you to look at your crystal ball and say, what's going to happen when your historical data doesn't necessarily match? And you have this qualitative idea that the historical data doesn't match. But then you have to quantify it and say like, okay, well, but what is going to happen? I'd be really curious. A lot of people are talking about California. California has a ton of solar as opposed to the hydro. I mean, they have hydro too, but there's a ton of talk about the California, 14 gigawatt swing that happens when the sun goes down, right? Taking the 14 gigawatts off of solar, and it has to transfer over to fuels in 20 minutes when everyone, as the sun is going down. And but this is a really cool and interesting problem as well. I think, it's really exciting. I think the Pacific Northwest is really exciting that there is so much hydro, that there is so much clean energy already, and that you're having this excess generation. And then, and looking at, and it feels like possibility. I think a lot of people are looking at the load growth part with a little fear that what is going to happen when everyone plugs in their EV? What is going to happen when everyone converts to electric heat or electric cooking or electric water heating? And this sounds exciting. This sounds like opportunity here because you have some buffer already on the system to say, yeah, let's try it. Let's bring it in.
It's funny you should mention opportunity because another opportunity, and this is something folks in the Northwest have been talking about for decades. But it might be happening right now, and that's markets. So we don't have an organized market in the Pacific Northwest. We still do a lot of bilateral transactions. And oftentimes, we know that there is significant value to hydro. You just mentioned what's happening down in California. In our hydro system, there is inherent long duration storage. And there's a great opportunity for us to be able to participate and integrate the renewables that are down in California through organized markets. So that's one of the opportunities that is cropping up in the area of, looking towards the future. But another thing in terms of I wanted to mention in terms of that, the load growth side. So Tacoma actually has a 40% ALICE population. That's asset limited, income constrained, employed. So working people that just are really struggling. And that's a huge segment of the population. And we know that whenever we do, any programs that we have around electrification is going to cost. So we're really concerned about the costs on that ALICE population and making sure that we're not burdening them. But we also want them to participate at the same time in this energy transition as well. So there's so many opportunities out there as we're looking forward to the future. But Tacoma is very also very cautious of that where we are and who our customers are as well.
I think it's really important. And it gets back to the equity issue. It gets back to the equitable transition. And it was funny because you were just talking about markets and opening up a market in the Pacific Northwest. And I think, that's the beauty of capitalism, right? The beauty of capitalism is we can help. How do we shape a market that can drive innovation towards something that's healthy for people, healthy for the planet, right? I think that's a beautiful example. Mm-hmm. But it's always got to have the guardrails, because then we shift over and talk about equity and talk about your ALICE folks, hardworking people who are struggling. And it's important to keep that in mind. And I think, it's a balance. It's a balance to make sure what's going to serve people. And I love that that's still a focus. And I think it's a powerful reminder for everyone listening that this isn't just about big faceless corporations making decisions. It's also about real people, real consumers. And, real consumers get to be a part of the solution by being part of this. So very cool. Well, so from that frame of what's going on in City of Tacoma, what you're seeing with planning for load growth, you also clearly have a hugely broad perspective, because, you were going to write letters to the Supreme Court. You were going to write a brief for the Supreme Court on a FERC order. So I'm curious your thoughts on the broader perspective across the US, and I mean, we could talk around the world too, like wherever you want to go, but like, what are the biggest challenges or roadblocks standing between us more broadly as society, culture, and the clean energy future?
I'm a hearts and minds person. So I worry about two things. I worry about greed and I worry about apathy. It's like so much of what's happening in the world right now. It can be easy. Like you have two options. Like you can close your eyes and pretend it's not happening because it's so overwhelming, the challenges that we have ahead of us. Or you can make sure you're going to be okay regardless of what happens, and who cares what happens to everybody else. Like those tend to be the extremes of where so much of society is at, and bringing us into a middle point of just compassion and caring about others. Like there's no greater compassion than worrying about the people that are going to be here that you'll never meet. Like they're not even born yet. You'll be dead long before they're born. Like that's where society needs to come, and not just our governments, right? And not just the thought leaders. Like it has to be something that society as a whole comes to that point of compassion. But those are the two things that I worry as being roadblocks, is that greed, and then of course the apathy. People who can see the world burning down, like, yeah, I see that it's on fire, but I'm not going to do anything about it. It's too much for me.
Well, I see that. I mean, those are kind of the shadow sides of things we've already talked about, right? Like the greed part is the shadow side of the capitalism part. So like, you're an economic part, techno-economic analyst, with a passion for demand response programs and the value of energy, and opening a new markets to help grease these wheels, but the shadow side of capitalism is greed, and like that economic growth at all costs, that making sure that we maximize profits. And so then that creates inequity. That's that. And then we have the other side we talked about, which was getting more participation, getting more awareness, more consumer engagement in the process. And that the shadow side of that is the apathy part, right? That like, but how do we get attention in a world that's clamoring for everyone's attention, where people are exhausted by very real things, not just like the silly stuff, like, TV shows and sport, professional sports and stuff like that, but also very real things like, where our attention is exhausted by the pandemic and, the stress of daily life and all of that. So I totally hear what you're saying. Like, and it does seem like the theme of what we're talking about with apathy and greed. All right. So from there, having acknowledged that, because we have to sit with that for a minute and acknowledge it, but let's not stay there. So from your perspective, what are the most important things that we should be doing to solve those challenges, to move through them toward the clean energy future?
Gosh, Amy, that's the $1 million question, right?
Right. So we're going to solve it right now. Like you and me, we're right here. That's something that I think about all the time. And I think I've thought myself to the level of burnout, right? Because I don't know that I know what the answer is. But I know what I'm doing. I can tell you what I'm doing. So I'm one of those people that just stays engaged. And I'm actually at that point where I think it might be time for me to pivot. So I have 10 years in education. I have 10 years in the energy field. And my underlying passion behind in both of those has always been the desire to help people, to have an impact.
So for me, I'm thinking maybe it's time to be more focused on creating impact for people. It might be time for a career change. Like I don't know. I wish I had a good answer for you, Amy, but aside from just saying, well, don't be greedy and don't be apathetic, right? Like that's not helpful. But I sometimes it changed me. You don't get to do the same thing you've always done and get different results. It just doesn't happen that way. So like every individual thinking of, really transformational thinking, introspective thinking. What do I need to be doing differently? And maybe it looks completely different for every different, individual, but that's where the point I'm at right now is looking internally at what I need to do differently so that I can be more impactful and bring other people along.
I love that. And that's been a theme that has come up for me lately in various interactions I've had, that like, sometimes it's just okay to like, want to make a change. I think this is going back into like personal philosophy, but like, I think I came into my career thinking that I was going to be a lifer, right? I was going to like work for the same company my entire career, doing the same things and like move up whatever ladder, I guess, and that story was written and I didn't literally leave any room. And I don't know. I feel like there's something of a cultural narrative around that like, that's good, that you should want to do the same thing all the time. And it's sort of like, your transition even from chemistry to electrical engineering is a microcosm, a little bit of that like people were like, but you liked chemistry. What happened to you? And it's like, you're allowed to just like not like that anymore and like want to do something else. Like there's, holding space for change, I think, and that maybe that's coming up as a theme too. Like you just said, it's like a transformational thinking that like, we're allowed to transform, we're allowed to change, and humans are bad at that. Humans really like stability and status quo, and they like everything to be the same. Even as creatures, we aren't the same ever. Like we change. Like that's just the nature of the game.
That so resonates with me, Amy. So like right now we're doing this clean energy transformation. I do not believe that when, and I might be wrong, I don't know, but I do not believe that when the first fossil fuels were exploited for generation purposes, that people knew the impact that they were going to have on the environment. When rural electrification, when we set out on that plan in the 30s to electrify the country, I believe that the intention was to raise up the nation economically and provide opportunities. We know the value of energy. But in that process, we harmed the environment, right? We may have had the best of intentions initially, but at one point we realized that the harm that we were having, and then that greed took over, and it didn't matter. Like there was too much money in the energy industry for folks to turn back. We're in a transition right now, right, where it's the original goal behind these renewable resources and these policies was for climate change and to mitigate climate change. And I believe we have those good intentions, right? And in this transformation, we could very well, 50 years down the road, find out that in this process, we've somehow harmed some other aspect of society, the environment or whatever. And we have to be able to pivot. Like when we know where we've gone wrong, we have to be able to change and to pivot. And that's, I wonder if we're, I don't know if we're there yet. Like, I feel like we're in this, we're so caught up in the transition right now that we're not, keeping our minds open to the possibility that in the future there may need to be some other aspect of another transformation necessary. So I I like to think about that and invite others to think about how we can keep that agility, do what we know is the right thing right now, but recognize that we don't know everything, and the time may come when we need to pivot again.
You are sparking something huge for me right now, because I think this is really the key. Like, let's spread this message, because I think, I run into this with just the way that we design like microgrids, taking it down to kind of a more micro level, no pun intended, that like, everyone wants like a standard microgrid solution, like a microgrid in a box. And we're like, well, it's kind of more complicated than that. We don't standardize around the hardware or the sizing. What we try to do is standardize around methodology, so that every time we approach a microgrid project, we're like, okay, the way that we're going about this is the same, even if the end look of the system is different. And I think what we need here is a similar idea, that like, it's about designing for change. As we're in the middle of this huge revolution or evolution of energy, the way we produce it and consume it and distribute it and all of that, it's not necessarily about the solution. It's about how can we engineer the flexibility to change, the flexibility to adapt. How can we learn from this and say, we're probably not going to get another 100 years of a system that doesn't change like we just had. Like, that was anomalous that we haven't had to change the architecture of the grid for so long. And now we know, like, let's anticipate change. Like, let's build it into what we do. Let's anticipate iteration. And so how do we do that? How do we design for change? I think that's the main question. And I love that you're shedding light on that. It's something I haven't necessarily articulated that way before. And you can bet it's going to become something I talk about now.
All right. Spread the word.
I mean, what do you think about that? What do you think about, like, I mean, is that possible? Like, from a utility perspective? So that's me, right? From the consumer client perspective. How about from your perspective, is like designing for change, designing for flexibility? Like, how does that feel?
Well, so I'll tell you, so my research was in distributed energy resources. And one of the great things about these distributed resources is that it is so flexible, and you can adapt and change and a lot more quickly. When you have these huge supply side resources that take years to build and last for decades, a lot of times the economics become a huge driver for not wanting change, right? The utility, like you build up these assets, and they get paid for over decades, and so that makes it hard. It makes it challenging for utilities. But that's why
there's a lot of inertia.
Yeah, and that's why I say we have to get to that point where money isn't the primary goal, and to be honest, it still is right now. When I run my optimizations, if you were to look under the hood, there's an objective function in there that says to minimize costs. That is still our objective function, right?
Totally.
Can we change that objective function? Can cost become a constraint and not be the objective all the time?
Ooh, yes. I love it. This is good stuff. Well, this has been wonderful. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts to share with our listeners before we wrap up.
I think the last thing I want to leave people with is what I mentioned earlier, is to find that middle ground at compassion. There's so much of our energy transition that's going to be economics and technology. And I don't think we have any shortage of technology. I don't think we have any shortage of economists out there. But what we could use a whole lot of is people who are committed to humanity. Like if we can get those folks involved in the energy industry, people who don't just want to get rich, and hey, that's fine, get rich, making the world a better place, but who are also concerned about humanity and everybody making it. People who want to see that future for everybody and not just themselves. That's what I would hope to leave folks with is don't forget the human factors, the human side.
Yes. Let's call that into being. Let's call compassion into this space for sure. Ahlmahz, it was a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can send me an email, cityoftacoma.org. But, you can find it online too.
You can. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. And listeners, thank you for being here. We don't take your time lightly. Thank you for being engaged in this conversation, moving us toward the clean energy future, kicking around new ideas, and maybe even designing for change. I want you to think about that one. And we'll see you next time for more ideas here at the whiteboard.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Power Flow podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please share the episode with other innovators, leave us a positive review, and subscribe to Power Flow on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find show notes for this episode, more great conversations, Power Flow merchandise, and more at powerflowpodcast.com. Power Flow is hosted by Amy Simpkins, produced by Devin Shonchek, and managed by Laura Novak. See you next time here at the whiteboard.